Welcome everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Today's session, this is the webinar for the QUT Centre for Data Science in collaboration with the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences. And the purpose of this webinar is to discuss topics that are in the news about and what data science has to do with those particular topics. So data and data science are a big part of our world. And we read in the paper about and in our news outlets about topics where we think, what does data have to do with that? And so what we do in these sessions is to explore the role of data science in the news. And today's session is going to be about data under attack. In other words, about cybersecurity and data security. And we've brought together 4 experts in that area who will each talk for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. So if you would like to ask some questions, then feel free to add those into the question and answers at the button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll be able to ask those questions of the panelists after they've finished each of their presentations. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement to country. This is the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people where we are here at QUT. I acknowledge the elders past, present and future as emerging leaders, and acknowledge that this has always been a land of learning, and we're proud and honoured to be able to carry on that tradition. So I'd like to introduce our speakers to start with. We have Mr. Rob Wiggin. So Rob, if you can just wave. So Rob is the Associate Director of Information Security, Digital Business Solutions at QUT. I'll tell you more about him in a minute. And we have Associate Professor Mark Burden. Mark is from the School of Law at QUT. And we also have then Associate Professor Cassandra Cross from the School of Justice at QUT. And our last speaker is Dr. Zara Jadidi. She's a Research Fellow in cybersecurity at the School of Computer Science at QUT. So the first speaker then will be Rob Wiggin, and Rob is, as I said, an Associate Director in Information Security. He's an accomplished IT professional. He has over 30 years of industry experience, and he's talked more about information security programs and managing secure information security operations than pretty much anybody that I know. So the talk he wants to give today, or to tell us about, is who wants my data, why, and what can I do about it? So over to you, Rob.
Great. Thanks, Kerry. I'll just share my screen. I've got some slides to come. Right. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Kerry. I'll jump straight into it because we've only got a couple of minutes. What I wanted to talk about is, what is my data and where is it coming from, and how is it being shared? And okay, so sorry. The first slide there just has a whole lot of things, and I'm not going to go through them all on how our data gets shared, but from what we do in our banking life, from what we do in location services through our mobile devices, what we do on social media, our healthcare, and so on and so forth. And what we've seen in recent years is that data has become extremely valuable, and not only for the data to be stolen for use for identity theft, but also for organisations having access to that data to make their decisions. And what we've seen in recent years is this big increase in cyber attacks. So we've seen some local organisations hit pretty heavily by cyber attacks, and particularly the ransomware attacks, which is all about organisations being kept away from their data in return for a ransom payment. But what we know is that the ransom payment doesn't necessarily get the data back. So that obviously is a big business problem. What we've seen in the threat landscape is the attackers are getting really clever. and there's more and more attacks all the time. They're using different methods, and they're really targeting individuals, particularly through social engineering. And I think a lot of us have seen the emails that come from our supervisor that says, contact me quickly, we need a payment to go somewhere. Or we get the tax office calling our phone saying, you know, we have to pay our taxes, or the police will come around and arrest you. And they're all methods of coercing people into either parting with their money or parting with their data. Here's the slide with the big scary numbers. These numbers came out of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and they estimate that the cost of cybercrime to Australian businesses is around that $29 billion mark per year. And half of the cost in that is the detection and recovery of these attacks. We also know that an attack can happen very quickly, but the detection of those attacks can take quite a long time. So the current statistics from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre was that it can take up to 286 days to actually detect a cyber attack if that's someone's in your network and doing damage, and it can take up to 80 days to actually contain that damage. And the other statistic is about 1 in 3 adult Australians have been affected by cybercrime in the last 12 months. So what can we do as individuals? We always talk about our cyber hygiene factors. So if we see something that doesn't look quite right, report it. Make sure you lock your devices, even if you're just walking across the room in your workplace. Strong passwords, keep them strong, change them often, don't share them. Don't connect unknown storage devices. If you pick up a USB stick in a coffee shop, it's not free. It's often got something bad on it. Use multi-factor authentication and biometrics where possible to identify yourself to your data. Remember to keep data backups. The best response to a ransomware attack is going back to your backup and being able to restore your data and continue your business as quickly as possible. Keep all your devices updated with the latest security patches. Try to use trusted Wi-Fi networks, or at least use a VPN if you can't use a trusted Wi-Fi network, so you can have secure communication. And be careful where you browse. A lot of these attacks just come from websites that have either been compromised or have been designed to attract people to do silly things. And my last slide. Where does data science fit into what we do? So we've been correlating log data that we collect from users with threat intelligence for quite a long time, and that still is one of our great weapons against cyber attacks. There's a lot of focus now on user behavioural analysis, so where we can identify what a user normally does, and if they digress from that behaviour, we can identify things that are happening. We can detect against the traffic patterns in their network. So what's talking to what? If something looks strange, then we can get an alert and we can investigate. What we're also finding is that AI and machine learning has been built into a lot of our standard controls. Visualization is becoming really important to us, so we can have a look now and compare incidents and in how they were done, how we reacted, and we can visualize that data. That's really useful to us. And lastly is measuring our performance. If we've got good data and we can represent that in our dashboards and our reporting, that really helps us assure our organisations that we're doing a good job in preventing cybercrime. That's all from me.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob. That's extremely interesting, thought-provoking, and scary. So, but it's very helpful to have those hints and tips about how we actually can do something about those scary numbers. So our second speaker is Associate Professor Mark Burden, and Mark is from the School of Law, and so this is a different perspective on this issue. Mark's an associate professor in the school, and his primary interests are in privacy, information privacy law, and the regulation of information security. So his work is really talking about the way that we think about complex privacy issues and the sensorization of everyday devices and infrastructures. He's just written a book called The Digital Data Collection and Information Privacy Law, published by Cambridge University Press. And Mark is going to talk to us now about securing personal information in a connected world. So I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Gary. What I'm going to do is, in terms of starting off, I'm going to look at piggyback from Rob a little bit, where Rob really laid out neatly the threat landscape and the problems that are facing at the minute. And then we're going to look a bit more broadly at the legal and regulatory reforms that are unfolding, because this is turning into a really fast-moving area where there's a lot of proposals on board at the Commonwealth level that would have significant changes to Australia's regulation of cybersecurity. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on that, because what we're seeing is a quick move from what used to be a largely self-regulatory approach to information security and cybersecurity to now what is a much more coherent regulatory approach, in which we're starting to see the development of a strong sense of the need for a coherent regulatory platform for cybersecurity across a range of different laws. So we'll look at that in a bit more depth, and maybe what we can do is we can get into the finer points of defining personal information and its role in the cybersecurity framework in the questions. So I'm going to look at 4 key developments that's unfolding, going back to 2019, and as I said, it was a really fast-moving area, to the latest development which came out this week. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share the screen. And unfortunately, what you're going to have to live with a bit is my writing. As all of my students know, this isn't the best thing in the world, but I will do my best to be as neat as I possibly can. So let's look at these 4 different areas quickly, and I'll show you how they all tie together in the context of different laws in relation to cybersecurity. So the first development that I want to highlight goes back to 2000, if you'll just excuse me a second, goes back to 2019, and that's the ACCC's Digital Platform Inquiry Report. And the DPI looked at the role of major platforms in the context of Australian competition and consumer law, with particular emphasis on Google and Facebook. And the emphasis on Google and Facebook was related to the role of the platforms, in particular in news media. And that was one strong component of the DPI. The other component of the DPI that's more relevant to this discussion is the focus on the role of the consumer, and the consumer in relation to platforms as collectors of personal information. And the DPI set the frame for trying to re-understand Australian privacy law at the Commonwealth level, which was now going to have a much greater consumer protection focus. And because it has this much greater consumer protection focus coming out of the DPI, we started getting critical questioning of the current information privacy law at the Commonwealth level, the Privacy Act, which leads us to our next major development, which is the Attorney General's Department review of the Privacy Act, which started last year and is going to run into this year. We've already had an issues paper that's been released and nearly 200 submissions in relation to that issues paper. That's going to roll into a discussion paper with final law reform proposals, a new bill for amending the Privacy Act next year. Now, what's clear from the review of the Privacy Act and where the Attorney General's Department is seeking or suggesting the Privacy Act should go is that it's largely picking up from the consumer protection focus of the DPI. So we're starting to see the development of a new construction of privacy, of information and privacy at the Commonwealth level, now through the Privacy Act, that's meant to have a much greater consumer protection focus. That in turn will bring out a new definition of personal information, which is core to the operation of the Privacy Act, enhanced penalties to make them more in line with the Australian consumer law, and a range of different potential reforms regarding better disclosures, better privacy policies, for example, of collectors of personal information. So between these 2 developments, what we see is a much greater focus on consumer protection as a privacy issue. And we're starting to see that through the courts, where we've had the recent ACCC action this year against Google, successfully challenging Google's privacy policy in relation to its collection of location data. So as I'm saying, we're starting to see this real emphasis of the protection of personal information into a consumer protection mold. On the other side of the developments that's unfolding, we have the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill of 2020. Now, this is a bill that's currently before Parliament as part of a biannual review of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, and it's seeking to put forward a number of key law reforms. First is the extension of critical infrastructure, which would now look at 11 different industrial sectors, which would be a significant swathe of the whole digital economy now in Australia, but also the development of what's called a positive security obligation. That would be a mandatory minimum level of principle-based standards for operators of critical information, of critical, of infrastructure. Most radically, and the one that's given rise to the most controversy, is also what's called a government assistance scheme. Now, this is a situation that if Australia does suffer a serious critical infrastructure attack, or it's likely that a critical infrastructure attack could unfold that could cause serious damage or serious risk of damage, this government assistance scheme would allow the Australian government to take over or partially be involved in the operation of the critical infrastructure. When you think about that, the critical infrastructure assets are now being extended to data holders. We've had companies like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon significantly pushing back at this proposal, because it could mean that the Australian government at the Commonwealth level could be involved in the operation of AWS, Amazon Web Services, for example, as a way of deflecting an attack, which of course has not gone down well with the major tech providers. The fourth part I just want to have a look at, which again I mentioned was a fast-moving area, has come out actually this week. And that's the Department of Home Affairs enhancements to cybersecurity regulation paper. And what's interesting from this discussion paper is that there is now an explicit recognition from industry that the Commonwealth needs to provide more detailed and more concentrated, focused levels of regulation than what we've had before in relation to cybersecurity. Now, probably the most key, so we have a whole range of different proposals coming out of this discussion paper, which again goes back to the disclosure measures of consumer protection, where you have one of the proposals is for labels on smart devices to indicate their security levels and what information is collected, etc. But what we also have is a proposal for a new privacy code that would provide a code for entities regulated under the Privacy Act about securing personal information. So this would be a more rigorous set of minimum standards that would require organizations regulated by the Privacy Act to make sure these standards are implemented. So it's a stronger effect than the guidelines than we currently have. Now, thinking about how these proposals hang together, and I'll just change colors in terms of the different areas of law.
So just 1 minute more, Mark.
That's all I need, Kerry.
Perfect.
And so if we think about these areas here, we have a very stronger consumer protection and data protection focus that's very much based on the role of the individual in the digital economy. And on this side of the scale, we have the role of asset protection in the form of critical infrastructure and national security. So in terms of this area of law, we're looking at the protection of the digital economy in order for the consumer and the digital economy to fully flourish. Now, the center point of all this is securing personal information, which is a point that perhaps we can dig out a bit further in questions. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you very much, Mark. eye-opening to see the developments in this area and to see how quickly it's moving. And I can only imagine the immense discussions that are happening about the legal aspects of this. And it's reassuring to know that that's happening on behalf of all of us. I'd like to introduce our third speaker for this session. Our third speaker is Associate Professor Cassandra Cross from the School of Justice at QUT. And so Cassandra's work focuses predominantly on fraud victimisation, and she's interested in the complexities of offending as well as the challenges that victims experience in seeking justice. And Cassandra is going to talk to us about that in the context of COVID-19. So the title of her talk is Fraud and COVID-19. I'll hand over to you, Cassandra.
Thanks very much. Just let me share my screen. Are we good? Thumbs up.
We're good.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to this session. It's fascinating to hear all the different perspectives on this. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the land on which I live and work, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and acknowledge, pay respect, to their elders' laws, customs and creation spirits. Today, I'm here to talk about fraud. I think back, I was invited to one of these seminars about 15 months ago where I was talking about fraud and COVID, I guess at the beginning of the pandemic, and just thinking about what could happen and some of the challenges that we were facing in those early months around the global pandemic. And here we are 15 months later, half the country is still in lockdown from COVID. And we are still in a very similar situation to what I described in my previous talk. But today I'll give an update around some of the, looking back on 2020 and looking back at some of the ways in which offenders have targeted victims globally and some of the losses that have resulted. So firstly, I think it's just really important to talk about a definition of fraud. So fraud is all about using deception in order to gain a financial or other advantage. So in most cases, offenders gain that financial advantage through direct money transfers, through gaining money finances from an individual, but it can also be through the targeting of personal information in order to then open up bank accounts, credit cards, lines of credit to get that financial advantage. Fraud is definitely not new, but it certainly has evolved with technology. And as we continue to live our lives online in greater ways, then offenders have certainly transitioned their offending into an online environment. There are many different ways to perpetrate fraud, and I think it's important that we do recognise that whilst a lot of it is online, there is still an offline component to fraud, and offenders will use all communication platforms as needed. And technology has certainly exponentially increased the ability of offenders to target potential victims. And I think COVID has really exacerbated this in many different ways. So I just want to thank Rob for the stats that he provided at the beginning around cybercrime more broadly. They're horrifying if we think about the impact. These are some statistics for fraud specifically from 2020 from both Australia and around the world. So the ACCC, Australian Competition Consumer Commission, recently released its Targeting Scams report. It does that on an annual basis. And they reported that over $851 million was reported lost to fraud by Australians in 2020, which is up from $632 million in 2019, and I think it's about $487 million the year before. The US, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, reported $3.3 billion lost, which is up from 2.7 in 2019. Canada, 160 million, up from 121. And Hong Kong, this is significant, $2.96 billion, up from 148 million the year before. So what we're seeing consistently across official statistics, but also anecdotal accounts globally, is just this significant increase in fraud losses in 2020. And I think fraud has been tracking upwards. So I don't think it's unusual that we're starting to see kind of this trend and escalation of losses, but I do feel, and there are many that would support this, commentators and academics out there, that the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly contributed to some of these significant rises around financial losses from fraud. And it's interesting too, if we think about reporting, these are all official reports. The Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre in their report explicitly say that they anticipate only 5% of victims even report fraud. So we do know that fraud has one of the lowest reporting rates across many crime categories. If we think about why COVID was so attractive to offenders, we know that offenders are known to tailor their approaches to current world events. So there is research, and we looked at this previously in terms of natural disasters such as flood, fires and cyclones. Beginning of 2020, Australia was battling bushfires across the country, and there was significant horrific events that were unfolding in January last year. And offenders were targeting that. So I was at the time writing about offenders and bushfires, and then they very seamlessly transitioned into COVID and haven't really looked back from then. COVID-19, as we all know, has significantly disrupted and altered society at a global scale. So this has been through the use of lockdowns, through the use of social distancing, through restrictions of movement. Certainly here in Australia, we were protected in some ways from the devastation of the virus that was seen globally in terms of sickness and deaths. We didn't experience that to the extent that many other countries have. But as half the country knows right now, we have experienced lockdowns, and we continue to do so on a regular basis. And it's just altered, it's completely shifted the way we approach our relationships, the way we approach work, study and leisure. So citizens have embraced these online technologies across the family, work and social spheres, and offenders have certainly used that to their advantage. So I think one of the things that drives the success and the effectiveness of this is the anxiety and uncertainty that's been associated with COVID-19. So for many across the population, there is an increased level of anxiety around circumstances that are out of their control. And I think this has really played into the hands of offenders and really exacerbated their ability to effectively target individuals. So if we think about some of, I think, the risk factors associated with fraud victimization and some of the reasons that people are susceptible, it can be around isolation, around not having support networks. A lot of people have been physically and socially isolated as a result of what's been happening with COVID. We think about health factors. There have been many people that have been unwell, and certainly mental health, I think, has decreased across the population. And then things like unemployment, where so many people have lost their jobs or have lost hours or continue to be in very precarious situations. And that can, I guess, open them up to fraudulent pitches that seek to speak to that vulnerability in terms of giving them money. If we just take one of the stats from the ACCC's report, Victoria residents recorded the highest financial losses nationwide for the first time ever in the Targeting Scams report, doubling the losses that they reported in 2020 compared to 2019. And we do know that 2020 for Victoria, they spent a prolonged period in lockdown, so it had significant impacts. These are just to wrap up some of the themed approaches that we've seen for COVID-19. I'm assuming that everyone has probably been targeted in some way. There's been an increase in phishing emails from all sorts of government, business, banks, contact tracing now. I'm trying to get personal information. There's been huge issues around online shopping where people are buying fake or non-existent products. This was particularly the case at the beginning around the PPE equipment that was hard to access, and lots of people buying pets. Puppies were certainly an attractive thing that people were trying to buy that they were losing money to. We've seen completely different structures in working from home now, and offenders have used that in order to break into security systems and try and, I guess, leverage that. We've seen superannuation when the government announces things, offenders take that on board. And most recently, we've seen vaccination approaches where offenders require upfront payments in order to potentially kind of jump the queue or to target people's sensitivity or anxiety around this. And we've also seen, again, linking to phishing emails, instances where people are asked to register on a site, give over all of their information, but it's actually not an official site. This is the case particularly in England with the NHS. So if you're ever unsure, I just ask people to kind of step back, think about it, talk to somebody, trust your instincts if it doesn't feel right. There's a lot of interesting information on the ScamWatch website, which I direct you to. And that's it from me. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cassandra. That was excellent. It's again sobering statistics, but also good advice. So really appreciate that from both you and Rob. Okay, we come to our last speaker now. And so our last speaker is Dr. Zara Jadidi. So Zara is a research fellow in cybersecurity in the School of Computer Science here at QUT. So what we've seen in our speakers is a range of different disciplines and areas around QUT that have come together to talk about this particular issue of data under attack. And Zara's particular interest here is in the security of cyber-physical systems and the automation of security analysis. And Zara is going to talk to us about this in the title, Cyber-Physical Systems Security. So over to you, Zara.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you see my shared screen?
We can.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me for this seminar. So my topic is cyber physical system securities. But what are cyber physical systems? Cyber physical systems are integration of computation, networking, and physical processes. So nowadays we can see lots of engineering devices which are connected to networks and internet. Example of cyber physical systems are smart grids and industrial control systems. Today, I just want to focus on industrial control system as part of this cyber physical system. We are in the era of Industry 4.0, the fourth revolution of industry. The first revolution was when people tried to use mechanical production. And then in the second revolution, they use electrical energy. And then in the third revolution, they use IT and computer in the industrial environment. And now we are in Industry 4.0, the fourth revolution. But what happened in Industry 4.0? We used to have some isolated industrial environment which were isolated physically and with no connection to outside world. But nowadays we have Industry 4.0. There are lots of new components. I just explained some of these. So automation, we will have lots of robots in industrial environment, connection, many devices in industrial devices are connected to internet. We have Internet of Things, lots of small sensors which are connected to different places, safety sensors or sensors in vehicles and machine-to-machine communication. We have big data, huge amount of data, high velocity, different variety of data, artificial intelligence that can make decisions, and cloud computing. We can store data on cloud and we can monitor data, this big data on cloud. But you can see all these new components are bringing lots of facilities, but the problem is that with each single component, we will have lots of new vulnerabilities and they cause new security risks. So when we want to use, at this time, when we want to use each of these components in our industrial environment, we should know the vulnerabilities and we should know what type of security risk they bring to our network. And then based on that, we should decide what type of security policy or training or security countermeasures do we need. So there are lots of cybersecurity challenges in Industry 4.0, but I just, because of the time, I just listed a few of them. The first one is people. People always are the most vulnerable part of security. So people, even in industrial environment, they are industrial people, they don't know about security. And even in security analysts, they mostly know about IT network, they are not familiar with ICS network, industrial network. And also with all of these interconnected devices, we have lots of vulnerabilities, and attacks in this industrial environment, they have multiple steps. So if they can get access to one of these small devices, they can then they can jump from one device to another device, and then they can reach the final device and have some damage. And also this Industry 4.0 may be connected to a legacy industrial systems. So those old devices have lots of vulnerabilities. They are not designed for security, and now connecting them to a new technology just bring lots of new security risks. And the last one is poor visibilities. In industrial environment, there are lots of blind spots and we can't monitor the data. So if something happened at that point we can't detect it. So these are some of the security challenges, but there are lots of more challenges as well. So we need to train people. We need to bring some new security devices, security policies. But first of all, before just deciding about these policies and training, we should know what's happening in our network. We should have the knowledge about our network and the vulnerabilities of our network. There are different resources that we can use that can give us the detailed information about attacker behavior. And as Rob said, then we can use machine learning and artificial intelligence to analyze the pattern of this behavior and detect new anomalies. So multi-attack matrix is one of the examples. So they can provide, provided a matrix with all of the possible techniques. So as I said, each attack has multiple steps, and this matrix provides all possible techniques for each steps. And for each technique, it tells you that which resources will be affected by that technique. And then it gives you the techniques that are used by well-known attacks. So using these resources, you know that what may happen, what's the similarity between these techniques and your network, and then you can compare it, and you can get knowledge about your network. And based on the vulnerabilities that you find from your network, you can have your security policies and future training. And for Industry 4.0, we need a similar metrics for all components. For example, this is for IT network. We have similar ICS metrics for ICS networks. There are similar resources for machine learning, for artificial intelligence, and for IoT devices as well. And using these ones, we can find the picture of our network and all the requirements of our network, and we can have some kind of threat modeling in our network, and then we can decide about security requirement in our Industry 4.0 network. That was almost it, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zara. That's very interesting. And I'll just, that finishes our set of presentations. But please ask any questions if you have them. Put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And I'd like to just follow up then, Zara. And you talked a lot about the sort of the environment, but what are you doing particularly in your research?
So in my research, I'm working on cybersecurity and mostly application of artificial intelligence in cybersecurity of industrial systems. So we have used some machine learning methods to automate the analysis. So if something happens in the network, what's the normal behavior? We can learn the normal behavior of machines. And then if anomaly happens, we can detect it. And also we can predict the next step of the attack by training machine learning.
Okay, that's very interesting. And how big is the group that you're working with at QUT? Are there many people working in this area?
Yes, we have a different project, PhD project, postdoc project, and HANA project in this area. So as I said, there are different groups, but some of them are working on application of machine learning. Some are just specifically working on improving the security and protocols. But there are different groups, research groups.
Right, okay, thank you. So Rob, I'll turn to you then, and following on from the presentation that you gave and the information that you gave, what do you see as the current threat landscape?
Yeah, so I guess the last few months has really all been about ransomware. We've seen a number of significant ransomware attacks on specific organisations, particularly in the healthcare areas have been particularly targeted. But we've also seen food production with the JBS attack, and we've seen critical infrastructure with the Colonial Pipeline in the US that had also been the victim of a ransomware attack. So I guess so. The thing with ransomware attacks, or the biggest question that organisations now have, is around payment of ransoms. And it's a really interesting question. And I was talking to some people from the state government yesterday about this, and there's still this view that there might be circumstances under which you might pay a ransom. I'm of the view that we shouldn't, because of where that money ends up going to. And you have to be very careful from a regulatory perspective as well, that it's not going to, it can't be attributed to a sanctioned country or a terrorist organisation. One of the views that people have is that a lot of these ransomware attacks now, they come along and they steal your data first, then they encrypt your data so you can't access it. And then they say, well, if you want to access your data and you want your data not to be released publicly, then you need to pay us the ransom. Now, my view on that is probably if your data's been stolen and there's a ransom demand there for it, you've probably lost the battle already. And all you're going to do is make yourself a bigger target for more ransomware attacks. Sorry, you're not necessarily going to get your data back anyway. So there's probably, and you've probably got legal implications that you need to worry about with that as well. So I know I've dived deep into the ransomware thing, but it is sort of the biggest attack that we're seeing in our threat landscape at the moment. One of the things we also talk about in university space is around nation state attacks. And I did some reporting to the federal government last year on this, and we did some analysis on all the attacks we see. And the nation state attacks were still quite a small percentage. Cybercrime for profit was by and large the biggest impact we have with our incidents. So whether it's compromising a user account to be able to change payroll details or things like that, or getting somebody's personal details so they can create bank accounts on their behalf and so on and so forth. So yeah, so cybercrime for profit and ransomware for profit are the two biggest trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. In fact, there's a question from the chat that says, with so many ransomware cases happening these days, so what are some good resources that people can access to learn more about safeguarding their online access and their information?
Yeah, look, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre published lots of good material and lots of good training material for that. I think you'll also find there's some good advice on the ScamWatch site that Cassandra referred to. So there's lots of government resources, and they're continuing to develop those out. So that's probably your starting point. There are also plenty of industry partners that are willing to help you for a small fee around this stuff as well. So there's there are plenty of resources out there, but start with the government ones, I would say.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I'll segue then to Cassandra. And follow on from that to go, Cassandra, would you like to speak a little bit about prevention?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think prevention has always been challenging in the fraud space, and for many years now, there's been difficulty in trying to pitch a prevention message that is broad enough for the population, but also, I guess, targets is received by individuals, because one of the biggest challenges in this area is people don't think that they can be victims. They don't think that this will happen to them, their family, their friends, their company, their business, etc. And the reality is that everyone is potentially a target, and it's not to scare people, but it's just to acknowledge the reality of the situation. And Rob has certainly spoken very eloquently about that in terms of the threat landscape that he's just outlined. One of the, challenges with COVID that I'm starting to unpack in some of my research is around particular types of fraud. So a good example is recruitment schemes, for example, that target those that are seeking employment. So they advertise job opportunities that don't exist. And in doing that, they try to harvest personal information from potential applicants, as well as upfront payments in many circumstances. Research prior to COVID-19 looked at the different types of indicators to look for these types of fraudulent job ads, and working from home was one of the characteristics that kept coming up across all of the research. And if we now think of this in a COVID context, the workplace has changed. We've embraced work from home, and many companies are shifting to work from home models, and that is, I think, expected by a lot of individuals. So I think we have to relook at some of the ways that we've the risk factors that we looked at for fraud prior to COVID-19 and recognising that they are now changing and may not be as effective as they once were.
Right. Okay, thank you, Cassandra. That's really informative. And Mark, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that then. And Cassandra's comments about individuals and how people are sort of seeing this and being targets and talking about prevention. What you mentioned in your presentation about talking about personal information and the legal landscape of personal information. Would you like to comment some more on that?
Yeah, sure, Kerry. And I think what I can also do is tie into both Rob's and Zara's presentations, particularly Rob's slide, you know, that first slide that Rob had, just by the sheer amount of data that's now being collected. And because of that data and its ability to connect to individuals, what data is personal information and what data isn't personal information becomes really complex, especially so in Australia. And I'll walk through that a bit. But also in terms of going to Zara's slide about the Industry 4.0 and the connection of infrastructure to IoT, sensorized devices. Essentially what it means is that we are part of the infrastructure. If you think about telecommunications, communications, our mobile phones are part of the communications infrastructure. And so the data that we generate has an infrastructural context. It's not just data about us anymore, it's data about our infrastructures, which leads to what Cassandra was saying. The context of risk assessment and risk prevention here becomes really complex because the infrastructures are no longer siloed. They're now everywhere. We are part of the infrastructure, and so those infrastructures are deeply embedded in our societies. So what that means in the context of personal information becomes really important, because information privacy law only provides protections regarding collection use of personal information. So anything that's personal information gets protections. Anything that isn't personal information doesn't fall under the rubric of the Privacy Act. So there's two really vital ways to think about this. One is the construction of the definition of itself and what that definition actually says about the underlying legal framework. In Australia, the definition of personal information in the Privacy Act is information about an individual that is identifiable or reasonably identifiable. Take the GDPR, for example, the word about is replaced with relates. And you think the context of the submission of one word for another doesn't actually make that much difference, but it makes a crucial difference, as we found out from a whole series of litigation in Australia involving the Privacy Commissioner, a journalist called Ben Grubb, and Telstra. And up until that series of litigation, the way you conceptualize personal information is that if somebody is identifiable from the information, then you would say that information is about that individual. So personal information was constructed in the context of identifiability. The series of the Grubb Telstra litigation changed that to where the test, which has now been confirmed through the federal court, is that the first question you now have to ask is this information about a person? So is it a subject matter characterization? Does it say something about the individual? And if so, is then the individual identifiable? So if you think about your mobile phones, for example, just to work this through, if you think about battery life data on a mobile phone, is that data about the phone? Clearly it is. Or is that data about you? Does it tell you how you're using the phone? So to start with the subject matter characterization becomes really problematic in the context of a broad range of protections, because you're potentially limiting the scope of information privacy law protections. Under the GDPR, for example, the policy position is any data from a smart mobile device is personal data, so therefore it's covered by the GDPR. So as a policy level, you have a much broader rubric of protection, which goes to the second point, that in terms of the conceptualization of protections under legal frameworks, information privacy shouldn't be constructed as consumer protection, which is where we seem to be going. To my mind, what it needs to be constructed as is a fundamental right, such as the fundamental rights of citizenship and protections of data protection and privacy that you have under the GDPR and its link to fundamental rights of European citizenship. It's those broader jurisprudential conceptualizations that we need to broaden in order to provide sufficient protections to the increasing extension of the use of personal information across infrastructures, critical infrastructures, and everyday life. So I think that's actually the key issue that's unfolding, Kerry. It's not specifically the definition itself, it's the broader conceptualization of privacy, which is largely redundant here in Australia and therefore problematic.
Right. Okay, thank you, Mark. That's very insightful. I'm going to ask each of you, if you had to have one word of advice to people, individuals, and to organizations or to enterprises, what would that word of advice be? So this has come out of the blue for you, so please just take a moment to think about it. I'm going to start with you, Rob. What would you say would be your one word of advice?
Look, I think it's really about just keep your wits about you. So just make sure that you're taking notice of everything you do. Because that's when these compromises and fraud events occur, is when we're distracted or otherwise not paying full attention to what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. Zara.
Yeah, what I can say, as Mark mentioned, we all are part of an organization. So that would be good if we can, an organization can have all of the training for the staff and the people will be aware of the latest things that happen in cybersecurity. So I think training is very important.
Thank you. Mark.
My advice, Kerry, would be think before you do. So if you're a data collector, ask the critical question of, do I really need this personal information? So push back against what was euphemistically called big data logics about 4 or 5 years ago. And if you're an individual, do I really need to provide my personal information to this organization? And what am I actually doing providing my information to this organization?
Thank you. And Cassandra.
For me, it's actually just around having a conversation. I think we really need to have a societal shift around how we understand fraud vulnerability and the reality of victimization. And we need to bring it out of the shadows and remove the shame and stigma around it. And if we're having constructive conversations about these types of threats that are out there and the different approaches that we can receive, then I think it makes it less likely that offenders will be successful, because we can talk about it openly with others without that fear of shame.
Okay, thank you. Great words of wisdom from all of you. And the last thing I'd like to ask you, just very briefly, is if you were to look into the future, so 10 years into the future, now let's just do 5 years, the world changes too much for 10 years. So 5 years into the future, what's it going to look like in terms of this area? So do you see big changes afoot? Just very briefly, what will the future look like? Would anybody like to make a comment? Mark.
I'm happy to jump in there. I was actually thinking exactly the same question when I was pulling together this talk. In terms of the law and regulatory space, it's going to look very different in 5 years' time, I suspect. I think Rob's discussion about ransomware, that is a very hot topic at the minute, and I would be expecting to see some legislative responses to that over the next 12 to 18 months at the latest. And if you look at the law reforms that are taking place across the Digital Platforms Inquiry, the Privacy Act, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill, legally and regulatory, it's going to look quite a different landscape in 5 years' time.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment? Cassandra.
I'm probably a little bit pessimistic, but I think in 5, even 10 years' time, fraud is still going to be fraud, and there are still going to be millions of individuals globally losing money. I've been in this space for 13 years now, and I think back to the types of approaches that I was seeing 10 years ago, and the approaches are different, and I guess technology drives that, and also the context and circumstances that we're in drives the different ways that offenders target individuals. But sadly, I don't see fraud victimization going away anytime soon. It will just be the different types of methods and technologies that really influence how successful it is.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to all the time that we have, and it's been very interesting to talk to you all, different aspects of this topic, and bringing your expertise to showcase this area for people who are listening. I've really enjoyed it. I really appreciate your time, and I thank you on behalf of the Centre for Data Science and also the Queensland Academy of the Arts and Sciences. So I'm Kerry Mengerson, I'm the Director of the Centre for Data Science. And on that note, thank you everybody and goodbye.